Ethiopia, 1896. Amid the roar of Italian cannons and the haze of gunpowder, a king on a white horse raised his cross and shouted, "Ethiopia will not kneel." His name was Menelik II, the man who made all of Europe bow before freedom. In the heart of East Africa, in the rugged highlands of Shoa, a boy was born in 1844 destined to change the fate of an entire continent. His name was Saleh Mariam, but history would remember him as Menelik II, the son of a land torn by rival kings, tribal wars, and the looming shadow of European ambition. Ethiopia was no stranger to conflict. For centuries, it had resisted conquest, a Christian kingdom surrounded by empires and colonizers hungry for gold, land, and souls. Yet by the mid-19th century, the country was fractured. Every noble dreamed of a throne, every warlord claimed to fight for God, and every hilltop fortress guarded its own flag. In this chaos, the child Menelik was taken from his home and delivered to Emperor Tewodros II, not as a guest, but as a hostage. Tewodros was a man of contradictions, a visionary who dreamed of a united Ethiopia, but ruled through terror. He whipped nobles, burned villages, and executed anyone who defied his will. Young Menelik watched in silence. He learned not from the emperor's triumphs, but from his mistakes how power could destroy itself when it forgot mercy. For years, he lived in the mountain fortress of Magdala, a captive prince with the eyes of a student and the patience of a hunter. He studied the empire's rival provinces, memorized trade routes, and listened to soldiers whisper about rebellion. He watched how European envoys flattered Tewodros with gifts and maps, and how, behind those smiles, lay the sharp edge of empire. When opportunity came, Menelik did not hesitate. Under the cover of night, he escaped from Magdala and rode for days through barren valleys to reach Shoa. Locals hid him, priests blessed him, and by the time the emperor discovered the betrayal, Menelik was already beyond his reach. He was no longer a boy. He had seen tyranny up close, and he had survived it. Standing before his loyal men, he swore an oath that would echo through history. Ethiopia will be one, and no foreign tongue will ever define our freedom. When Menelik returned to Shoa, he found a land weary of blood and division. The people wanted peace, but peace without strength was a fragile dream. He knew that to unite Ethiopia, he would need not only swords but vision, a bridge between ancient pride and modern power. He began by reforming his army. Warriors who once fought with spears now trained with rifles purchased from France and Britain. Yet he refused to let his soldiers forget their roots. "The gun may be European," he said, "but the heart that holds it must remain Ethiopian." He forged alliances with chiefs through marriage, trade, and diplomacy, uniting tribes that had fought each other for generations. Menelik also saw the importance of the outside world. While other African rulers signed treaties they couldn't read, he studied every document, every clause, every translation. He learned to play the game of empires, France against Italy, Britain against Egypt, always keeping Ethiopia's sovereignty at the center. By 1889, Emperor Johannes IV, who ruled the northern provinces, died in battle against the Mahdists of Sudan. The throne of Ethiopia was empty, and Menelik, the once forgotten prince of Shoa, was the only man with the legitimacy, the army, and the will to claim it. When he entered Addis Ababa, drums echoed through the valleys, priests carried crosses high above their heads. The people shouted his name, "Menelik! Menelik!" To them, he was more than a king. He was a symbol of unity, the promise that Ethiopia could stand on its own feet in a world carved by European greed. But even as he was crowned emperor, a letter arrived from Rome. It was written in two languages, Amharic and Italian, and hidden in that paper, beneath words of friendship, was a trap that would soon set Africa on fire. In May 1889, Emperor Menelik II signed what seemed a harmless diplomatic agreement with the Kingdom of Italy, the Treaty of Wuchale. It was meant to formalize friendship and define Ethiopia's northern borders. The Italian envoys smiled, presented fine wines and rifles, and promised support for a modern African kingdom. But in diplomacy, deceit often hides behind translation. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia may use Italy as an intermediary in its foreign relations. Yet in the Italian version, that same clause read, Ethiopia must conduct its foreign affairs through Rome, a single word transforming an equal alliance into colonial subjugation. For a time, Menelik did not suspect the betrayal. He was focused on stabilizing his empire, building roads, expanding trade, and training his army with new rifles and artillery. Italian advisors were welcomed in court, and merchants in Addis Ababa prospered. Rome believed it had gained a protectorate without firing a single shot. But Ethiopia was not a land to be deceived so easily. When Menelik discovered the false translation in 1893, his fury shook the palace. The emperor gathered his ministers, slammed the treaty onto the table, and declared, "No one speaks for Ethiopia but Ethiopians themselves." He sent word to Rome, rejecting the treaty and all claims of Italian authority. Italy, blinded by arrogance, responded with an ultimatum: accept the protectorate or face war. Menelik's answer was silence, followed by action. He began preparing the nation for battle. Guns were bought from France and Russia, ammunition was stored in hidden caches, and messengers rode across mountains carrying a single call: "If you are sons of Ethiopia, rise." Priests preached from pulpits that defending the motherland was a divine duty. Farmers melted their jewelry to buy bullets. Women prepared food and bandages for the soldiers. It was not a war for conquest, it was a war for dignity. In Rome, newspapers mocked Menelik as a barbarian playing king. They wrote that one Italian division could crush the savages in a day. But Menelik had studied the empires. He knew arrogance was their greatest weakness. As Italian troops advanced south from Eritrea, they found not a disorganized tribe, but a nation, awakening a land united by faith, fury, and memory. The drums of Adwa were beginning to echo. In the winter of 1895, Menelik stood before thousands on the hills of Addis Ababa. Wind whipped through the flags of red, yellow, and green. His voice carried across the plain: "Ethiopia does not fight for gold or land. We fight for the right to stand unchained before God." Messengers galloped across provinces to the Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigray, the Guraj carrying his command. From every corner, men came with shields, spears, and rifles. Women sang songs of courage. Priests blessed the armies, lifting crosses into the cold morning air. By February 1896, the call had become a movement. More than 100,000 Ethiopians marched north: farmers, traders, hunters, and nobles, each answering Menelik's summons. Among them rode his wife, Empress Teitu Betul, a woman of fierce intellect and unbreakable will. She organized logistics, commanded artillery, and inspired soldiers with her presence. The Italians, led by General Baratieri, had 17,000 men, well-armed, trained, and confident. They believed victory would be swift. After all, no European army had ever lost a war to Africans. But as Menelik's army gathered near the mountains of Adwa, the emperor prayed before the cross he carried since childhood. His generals stood in silence. "God has placed this burden upon us," he said, "and he will judge how we bear it." When dawn broke, the valleys shimmered with shields and rifles. From a distance, the Ethiopian army looked like a living sea. Europe thought it would be a massacre. They were right, but not in the way they expected. At dawn, on the 1st of March 1896, the sun rose over the jagged peaks of Adwa. Mist drifted between the valleys as the Italian columns advanced, unaware that they were marching into a trap centuries in the making. Menelik had studied every ridge, every slope, every path. He knew the land as if it were an extension of his own body. The Italians, overconfident, believed Ethiopian forces were scattered. Their maps were wrong. Their intelligence was worse. By splitting their army into 3 divisions, they walked straight into the jaws of encirclement. From his command post on a hilltop, Menelik watched through his spyglass. When the first cannon sounded, he lifted the cross in his hand and whispered a prayer. Beside him, Empress Teitu commanded the artillery, her voice steady and sharp. "Aim for their center," she said. "Let them taste the wrath of Ethiopia." Then, the mountains erupted. The ground shook beneath thousands of feet. Waves of Ethiopian warriors descended from the ridges, their cries echoing through the smoke. Drums thundered, horns blared. The Italians, surrounded on all sides, found no escape. Their modern rifles spat bullets, but the Ethiopians kept coming, disciplined, organized, relentless. For every man who fell, another rose, shouting, Ama Sejanalo, thanks be to God. By midday, General Baratieri's lines had collapsed. The Ethiopian cavalry charged through the gaps, slicing through the artillery positions. Soldiers from the Oromo and Tigray fought side by side, united by faith and fury. Menelik rode forward, not as a monarch watching from afar, but as a leader among his people. When the dust settled, the valley was silent. 7,000 Italians lay dead. 1,500 more were captured, including dozens of officers. The tricolor of Italy, once the symbol of European might, was torn down and replaced by the Lion of Judah. One Italian officer wrote in his diary before being taken prisoner, "We did not lose to an army, we lost to a nation." The victory at Adwa was more than a battle won. It was a humiliation so profound that Europe trembled. For the first time in the modern age, a European empire had been defeated by an African state, not through luck or numbers, but through strategy, courage, and unity. As the smoke cleared, Menelik dismounted and walked among the wounded, both Ethiopian and Italian. He ordered that captured soldiers be treated with respect. "Let the world see," he said, "that Ethiopia's strength is not in cruelty, but in honor." That day, history shifted. Adwa was no longer just a place. It became a word that meant freedom. The news of Adwa traveled faster than any army. Within weeks, the world was stunned. In Europe, newspapers struggled to explain how a primitive nation had crushed one of their own. Italian cities erupted in protests. The prime minister resigned in disgrace. Mothers of fallen soldiers wept in silence. But beyond Europe, a different fire was spreading. Across Africa, enslaved and colonized peoples whispered Menelik's name as if it were a prayer. In South Africa, the Zulu warriors said, "If Ethiopia can stand, so can we." In the Caribbean and the Americas, black newspapers called him the Black Napoleon. Churches rang bells in Harlem. Poets in Kingston and Lagos wrote hymns to Adwa. For colonized nations, Ethiopia became a living symbol, proof that Africa was not doomed to submission. Menelik's victory cracked the illusion of European invincibility. The myth of white supremacy bled at Adwa, and the whole world saw the wound. Diplomats from Britain, France, and Germany scrambled to send envoys to Addis Ababa. Ethiopia, once ignored, was now treated with respect, not out of friendship, but fear. Menelik received them in a palace newly adorned with maps, telegraphs, and the shining cross he had carried into battle. "Ethiopia bows to no empire," he told them, "but she will speak with those who speak with honor." Even Italy, humiliated and broken, was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, recognizing Ethiopia's full independence. For the first time in centuries, Africa had forced Europe to retreat, not by pleading, but by victory. Yet Menelik understood that true freedom required more than battlefield glory. "War gives us independence," he said. "Wisdom will keep it." So he turned his eyes building toward schools, hospitals, railroads, and telegraphs. While the rest of Africa was carved into colonies, Ethiopia stood unchained, a beacon for generations yet unborn. Adwa had changed the world. But for Menelik, it was only the beginning of a greater mission, to prove that freedom could survive peace as well as war. In the years following Adwa, Menelik II faced a new challenge, one that no sword could solve. Victory had united Ethiopia, but peace demanded transformation. The emperor who had crushed an empire now turned to building one, not through conquest, but through creation. He chose Addis Ababa, once a small settlement of huts and churches, as the heart of his empire. From the ashes of war, he dreamed of a city that could stand beside London, Paris, or Cairo. He ordered the construction of wide roads, palaces, schools, and hospitals. Caravans arrived daily, loaded with timber, marble, and European machinery. Menelik would often ride through the streets on horseback, greeting workers by name, reminding them that our hands build what foreign powers could never give us: dignity. He saw education as the weapon of the future. Priests and scholars were sent abroad to learn medicine, engineering, and law. Upon returning, they opened Ethiopia's first modern schools. Menelik founded a printing press, issued Ethiopia's first currency, and introduced postage stamps carrying the Lion of Judah. Under his rule, Electricity flickered in Addis Ababa for the first time, a symbol of light, reclaiming a once darkened continent. Foreign merchants were welcomed, but always on Ethiopia's terms. Trade, not rule, Menelik would say. The French built the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, but Ethiopia owned the land it crossed. When British diplomats offered advisors to modernize the administration, Menelik smiled and replied, "We modernized the Italians at Adwa. We can handle our own." Empress II, his partner in both war and statecraft, became the symbol of the new Ethiopia. She established the first hotel in Addis Ababa and organized the imperial court with precision and dignity. Together, they ruled as equals, a rarity even in Europe. But progress came with a cost. As the empire expanded, local revolts flared. Some feared Menelik's reforms would erase old traditions. Others accused him of favoring foreign technologies over Ethiopian ways. Menelik listened, often in silence, before reminding his council, "Freedom without knowledge is like a sword without a hand." He knew that true independence was not won once, but defended every day in classrooms, in markets, in mines. By the dawn of the 20th century, Ethiopia stood alone, the only African nation untouched by colonial rule, the only black empire recognized by the white world as an equal. Menelik had not just defeated Italy, he had defeated history's expectations. Time, however, is a conqueror no king can escape. In 1909, Menelik suffered a devastating stroke that left half his body paralyzed. Addis Ababa fell into quiet mourning. The emperor who once thundered across battlefields could now barely speak. Yet even in silence, his presence commanded respect. From his chamber, he watched the empire he had built continue to grow. Trains ran through the plains, telegrams carried news from Djibouti to Gondar, and school bells echoed across the highlands. But his health continued to fade, and power began to shift toward his wife, Empress II. Court intrigues multiplied. Foreign powers, sensing weakness, returned with offers and schemes. Menelik's ministers argued over succession, each fearing that Ethiopia's unity might die with its emperor. The shadow of the very chaos he had once conquered began to creep back. Yet Menelik's spirit remained unbroken. On one of his last lucid days, he asked to see the cross he had carried at Adwa. He touched it gently and whispered, "Do not let them write our story in their language." He died in 1913, in the palace he had built with his own vision. The empire mourned not just a ruler, but a guardian. Bells rang for 3 days. Thousands of men and women lined the streets as his body, wrapped in white linen and the colors of Ethiopia, was carried to the Church of St. Mary in Addis Ababa. There, beside the altar, he was laid to rest with the same cross he had raised against Italy resting on his chest. The priests chanted hymns of victory, not sorrow. "He has not died," they said. "He has returned to guard our freedom." Empress II outlived him by years, tending to his memory as carefully as she once tended his armies. She refused to let his legacy fade beneath foreign ink. "Menelik is not a story of war," she told a visiting diplomat. "He is a story of dignity." Though his body weakened, his ideas remained alive in the schools, the churches, and the courage of his people. By the time the world plunged into the Great War, Ethiopia's flag still waved unbowed, and every time the cannons roared in Europe, an echo whispered through the African highlands. Menelik's prophecy was right, no empire lasts forever. More than a century has passed since the thunder of Adwa echoed through the mountains, yet in Ethiopia, the name Menelik still stirs the blood. Every year on March 1st, crowds gather in the capital to celebrate Adwa Victory Day. Children paint the flag on their cheeks. Elders lift their voices in hymns. Soldiers march beneath portraits of the emperor who refused to kneel. At the heart of Addis Ababa stands a bronze statue, Menelik II on horseback, his cloak flowing in the wind, his sword raised toward the northern hills where history was rewritten. Pigeons rest on his crown, and in the morning light, the metal glints like fire. People stop to pray before the monument, whispering thanks to the man who gave them a nation unbroken. To Ethiopians, Menelik is not a relic of the past, he is a presence. His victory at Adwa is taught in every school, sung in every church, and remembered in every home. It is more than pride, it is identity. It reminds a country surrounded by once colonized neighbors that their freedom was not gifted. It was defended, inch by inch, by their ancestors' courage. Across Africa, Adwa became a spark that refused to die. The Pan-African movement drew its first breath from Menelik's triumph. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Haile Selassie, and Jomo Kenyatta spoke his name as proof that black nations could stand tall among the empires that once chained them. Even in distant lands, his story inspired hope. In the Caribbean, reggae singers praised King Menelik, Lion of Judah. In Harlem, preachers told congregations that Ethiopia's victory was the beginning of black redemption. The Rastafari faith, born decades later, would call Ethiopia Zion, the spiritual homeland of freedom. Today, the echoes of Adwa are found not only in history books, but in the hearts of ordinary Ethiopians. Farmers plowing the highland soil, children studying by candlelight, and elders telling stories by the fire all share the same quiet certainty that their country's soul was tested and never broken. And when the sun sets over the mountains of Adwa, the wind still carries a whisper, faint, eternal. Ethiopia will not kneel. Menelik II's body may lie beneath stone, but his defiance lives wherever freedom is threatened. His victory did not end colonialism, but it shattered its illusion. It proved that courage, faith, and unity could bend even the iron of empire. Adwa was not just Ethiopia's triumph. It was Africa's heartbeat, a reminder that chains, no matter how heavy, can be broken by belief. History often crowns conquerors, not defenders. But Menelik II's glory came not from taking lands, it came from protecting his own. He did not dream of empire. He dreamed of dignity. In his eyes, freedom was not a prize to be won once, but a covenant to be renewed with every generation. When Italy retreated, he refused to humiliate the captured soldiers. Instead, he sent them home with food, medical care, and a message: "Tell your kings that Ethiopia fights only for justice." It was an act of mercy the world did not expect and perhaps could not comprehend. That choice defined him more than any victory. Menelik proved that power is not measured by how many enemies one destroys, but by how many souls one refuses to. His words still resonate. We did not win because our guns were stronger. We won because our hearts believed that freedom is worth dying for. Ethiopia became a mirror for humanity, a reflection of what nations could be if they fought not for domination but for self-respect. Menelik's triumph gave birth to an entire generation of dreamers who refused to see Africa as a continent of victims, but as a continent of victors waiting to be remembered. When the winds of war returned in the 20th century, and fascist Italy once again invaded under Mussolini, Ethiopia stood firm, and though it fell briefly, its spirit endured. Every Ethiopian soldier who fought then carried Menelik's ghost into battle. When the nation rose again in 1941, reclaiming its independence, they said simply, "Adwa has returned." Today, as the world faces new forms of conquest, economic, cultural, digital, Menelik's legacy feels more urgent than ever. His story is a warning and a beacon, that freedom must be guarded not by walls or weapons, but by unity, memory, and faith. In the end, Menelik II did not just save Ethiopia. He saved the idea that Africa could shape its own destiny, and somewhere, beyond the mountains where his horse once stood against the dawn, the sky still glows faintly red and gold, the colors of a nation that refused to bow. Because when Menelik shouted, "Ethiopia will not kneel," he was not speaking only to his soldiers. He was speaking to time itself.